Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yates Conwell. I'm here to welcome you to Grand Rounds in the Department of Psychiatry. I'm Vice Chair of the department and co-director with Kim Van Orden of the Postdoctoral Training Program in Suicide Prevention Research, which is the training arm of our Center for the Study and Prevention of Suicide, or CSPS, here in the department. And I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today, who's a special friend of the CSPS and of the department going back a long time. That's Dr. DeQuincy Meiffren-Lezine. Before I do introduce him, however, I'd like to give you some information, brief housekeeping kinds of things. And these are things you've heard before, but just to be sure we're clear today that the microphones and the cameras will be kept off for everyone. That's throughout the presentation today. But there'll be plenty of opportunity at the end to talk with Dr. Lezine about questions that you may have, and we invite you to put those questions at any time during the course of the presentation into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And that's not the chat box. We reserve the chat box for interpreters and for technical issues. So again, please put your questions at any time into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can at the end of the presentation. There are a couple ways for you to provide us feedback about the presentation today, and it's very important for us to have that kind of feedback to continue providing the best presentations we can here in the Grand Round space. Also, for you to receive continuing education credits, there's an evaluation form which we offer several opportunities for you to fill out. We'll post a link in the chat window towards the end of the presentation today, so keep an eye out for that. If you click on that, you can fill that out and be registered for CE credits. Also, there'll be a link at the end of the presentation and an email that we will send out to you as a registered participant in Grand Rounds today over the next day or so, which you're welcome to fill out as well. Those who attend 45 minutes or more in total of the Zoom session today and who complete the evaluation will receive credit for attendance. So let me turn at this point to introduce Dr. Lezine. Dr. Lezine received his undergraduate degree from Brown, after which he completed his doctorate in psychology at UCLA in 2005. We were very fortunate then to have Dr. Lezine join our postdoctoral research training program in suicide prevention research for 3 years until 2008, during which time he developed a program of research to understand and develop methods for enhancing community, that is layperson support for suicide prevention, with a specific emphasis on mobilizing suicide loss and attempt survivors. On completion of the fellowship, Dr. Lezine joined a research and evaluation partnership in Phoenix with a focus on both adult and youth programs relating to substance abuse, suicide prevention, violence prevention, and community development, a real theme throughout the remainder of his career. After a subsequent stint in San Francisco, Dr. Lezine opened his own research consulting and advocacy firm called the Prevention Communities and Lived Experience Academy, where he conducts and publishes applied research related to suicide prevention, with a particular emphasis on advocating for post-traumatic growth perspectives and using lived experience to inform suicide prevention, and that's the focus of his talk today. Dr. Lezine is a leading figure nationally in advocating for and studying the incorporation of lived experience perspectives and voices in suicide prevention initiatives. He's held leadership positions in most of the organizations nationally with that focus, speaks and publishes widely on the topic, and most importantly, Dr. Lezine makes all of us in the business of preventing suicide better at what we do. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you back, Quicks, and I will hand over the podium to you if you want to go ahead and share your screen. Thanks.
Thank you, Yates. Let's see if on.
Looks good.
All right, so excellent. Let's talk today about planning for safety as well as planning for post-traumatic growth. And I want to start just by kind of giving an overview of what I'm planning to talk about today. One is putting suicide within the context of quality of life for a person. A second is talking about the suicidal crisis path as informed by a lived experience perspective. The impact of community environment as it applies to bringing in lived experience to research and into clinical work. Some aspects of recovery and different forms of recovery. Some perspectives on safety planning and post-traumatic growth after a suicidal crisis. So let's jump into a view of quality of life and suicide within that context. If you can imagine kind of on this graph where you have on the y-axis quality of life going from 0 to 10, where 0 is somebody who is not alive anymore, so death, and 10 being somebody who is at their optimum, at their best possible quality of life. We might start off with saying that somebody could have a status quo existence, in which case they have some quality of life and it just kind of maintains over time. So they're not really going up or down, just maintaining what their average is. You can have a growth trajectory, right? And that's somebody who starts off at one level for quality of life and they add skills, they add some self-improvement, perhaps in the domain of physical health with exercise and increased nutrition, perhaps in terms of learning, or in terms of increasing their emotional health, perhaps through therapy or other means. And then we have this trajectory here where you're going to suicide. And their person's quality of life has deteriorated to the point that they feel like death is preferable to their life, in which case their quality of life has dropped down to 0. So ideally, we would want to have some intervention there, right? To stop the person from going on that suicide trajectory and bring them back up to where they had at least that status quo quality of life. So that's generally what we would consider kind of recovery. And a lot of times that has been considered kind of the ideal for people to achieve, returning to the quality of life that they had before the crisis happened. However, we also have this additional trajectory where somebody has dropped down their quality of life, kind of heading towards suicide. And the person then has some intervention that happens, and that brings them back up towards the status quo. But then after reaching that, they continue to improve their life. And so they end up back on a trajectory that's closer to that growth trajectory. And that is something we would consider kind of a post-traumatic growth, because they had the trauma, but as a result of the trauma, they have used that to spur their growth going forward. So let's focus here on that suicide trajectory where somebody has dropped out of the status quo and have headed down towards where they are pursuing death as an option instead of a low quality of life. In the process of working with the County of Fresno to develop their suicide prevention plan, we're thinking through kind of what leads a person to go from where they are just born to where they have died by suicide. And I had the belief or the philosophy that every suicide is preventable. If there was the possibility to have the right intervention reach the person at the right time, then we would have no suicides, because nobody is born suicidal. So at some point, something has happened that has shifted that person towards a suicide trajectory. And if it was possible to have all the right interventions in place, we would be able to stop the suicides. So then kind of thinking from an inside perspective, what is it that has taken this person from the point where they are born and everything is kind of set up at a baseline or a stasis level all the way to when they have died? And considering that they might start off with this baseline and experience some combination of internal biology or changes in biology, some life events, differences in their social or economic or physical environment, and those might lead a person to have higher risk. Then once they are at that higher risk, perhaps their mental health deteriorates, or they have some healthcare experiences that are either positive or negative in the case that's leading more towards suicide. And then some additional life events might push them to where they are then suicidal. Once the person is suicidal, then what would continue them on the trajectory would be their intent to die by suicide, their capability, their impulsivity, perhaps, their access to means for attempting suicide, and then that might lead them up to a suicide attempt. And then that final part that I have there is what determines if the suicide attempt moves on to being a death by suicide. And there you basically have some balance between the lethality of the act and characteristics of the rescue. So I kind of had a very detailed layout of this. This is kind of even a simplified version of the one that I had presented to Fresno, but we could simplify it even further to just say that you have some baseline character. They move to higher risk, they become suicidal. That might lead to a suicide attempt. And finally, that might lead up to somebody dying by suicide. So that's kind of the basic suicidal crisis path from an inside perspective of what might take me from the point where I have no suicidal risk at all to where I've died by suicide. But I wanted to focus in for lived experience on this context of developing risk. What takes somebody from the point where they're at baseline, they're at that status quo or stasis, to where they have that higher risk. And we might put this within kind of that social ecological model where you have some aspects of environment and policy. And that includes everything from kind of national or international level policies to what's in the physical environment. That impacts their community. And you might think of this both in terms of geographic community, like neighborhood or county, for example, as well as their social community. So some of the expansions that have happened with social media and with connections that people have through technology have kind of expanded what our definition of community might be, because there are these larger scale interactions between people and between groups of people. Then you have the group or organization level, and that's a little bit closer in towards the individual. The interpersonal level is mostly one person connecting to another, so dyad relationships, and then maybe perhaps very small group relationships like within a family. And then finally, that individual level. So one of the reasons why I wanted to specifically look at the context of developing risk is to point out that when somebody has lived experience, what that includes is all of their experiences within their culture, within their environment, that have led towards them developing suicide risk and therefore developing the suicidality that we might describe as having lived experience. So when we talk about bringing lived experience or engaging lived experience in clinical care or in research, the persons who we are engaging are bringing to bear all of the ideas, all of the concepts, all of the experiences that they have had that have contributed to that risk. So let's talk a little bit about what that had looked like when we were specifically working within the county of Fresno. So for public policy, we had examined kind of the financial policy within the area, kind of health policy. So what was deciding who would get public health care, who would not get health care, what the insurance regulations were, as well as housing developments, the labor market, as well as the environment, everything from how drought was impacting the farm and agriculture sector here to what was happening with the trucking sector. We moved a little bit closer to the community level, where you're looking at a high death rate, looking at poor health in general in the environment, poverty levels, unemployment, housing problems, crime, and we keep going down towards groups, either positive or negative. So religious involvement was one thing that we found in Fresno that was positive, but then there's also community outreach, again, pretty positive. Transportation, sometimes problematic, sometimes not. And then we might go to the interpersonal level, where there was family life impairment, as well as high crime, sometimes crime within the families, and then all the way down to that individual level where they had work impairment or psychological distress. And so all of these things are coming to bear when somebody is kind of developing that higher risk for suicide. And we're not necessarily sure when somebody comes into the clinical context or in the research context, what it is about their environment or about their past that has led to that individual having a higher risk. We need to talk to them to find that out. But when we do, what we might discover is the aspects of culture, the aspects of their community that have contributed to that person having risk. And in that way, we are bringing in a lot of information about our community and about perhaps racial disparities or that type of topic into the process of clinical care and into research by way of examining lived experience. I wanted to give kind of an example, and here the specifics for the graphs are not as important as noticing the patterns. This is kind of, the graphs are showing the life expectancy gap in years between Black and white individuals within the US, and the different colors show different regions within the US. The left-hand side is for men and the right-hand side is for women. But what I wanted to show here is when we were looking at that line at the beginning for quality of life, and I talked about status quo, where that starts off is going to be based on the person's context. So you can see here just a variability in terms of quality of life if you measure that within the basis of life expectancy. You could see a variability based on where somebody lives, what their gender is, as well as what their race is. So lots of these characteristics that we might describe as having an impact on our clinical care, on our research development. If you're turning in the direction of looking at race or ethnicity or gender, or looking at the impact of orientation, sexual orientation, lots of different identity characteristics. One of the ways that that has an impact is changing what that initial status quo is for an individual. And then from there, that is going to impact their possible trajectory towards suicide or towards other outcomes that are relevant to their quality of life. Let's talk some as well about adverse experiences or ACEs. And I had come across this idea of a tree of ACEs, a pair of ACEs. I think Most times that I've heard about ACEs, they've talked about adverse childhood experiences, which is at the individual level. But there are also some groups and research that has been looking at what it looks like from the community aspect as well, from that larger environment. And there you have adverse community environments. These will be things like poverty, experiences of discrimination, community disruptions, a lack of opportunity, the economic mobility, or presence or lack of social capital, their housing quality, affordability, and violence. You might notice that some of these things that they are listing as adverse community environments are topics that I brought up for looking at County of Fresno, possible contributors to suicide risk. Now, those would form the roots within the community that lead up to having adverse childhood experiences. And so those have been described as like maternal depression, emotional or sexual abuse, substance abuse, domestic violence, physical and emotional neglect, divorce, mental illness, incarceration, or homelessness. Those are individual circumstances that might happen within the family environment or what happened to an individual. But those are rooted in the types of adverse communities that might contribute to those being more prevalent. The ACEs studies have looked at, I think, 10 plus years longitudinally of somebody experiencing one of these kind of traumatic childhood events and what the outcomes would be later, and have found those to be connected to a range of negative outcomes, including suicide, including negative mental health characteristics, including violence. So lots of possible ways that quality of life could suffer based on what those initial experiences and environments might look like. I do also want to kind of specify at the very end of that trajectory, right? So we talked some about the beginning of the trajectory, how community context might contribute to developing risk, but I also want to then jump to the end part to how that might influence somebody's final stages where it connects a suicide attempt to a suicide death. Because the things that are going to make that more fatal might include deliberate planning that a person has, choice of a lethal method, and if that method has a short course of action. Those might be characteristics of the individual and the individual's choice. However, there are also aspects of the community that will have an impact on whether or not the suicide attempt ends up being lethal, including the speed of the intervention and the adequacy of the treatment. So if the suicide attempt has the exact same characteristics, but takes place within the context of where somebody is in a place where the resources are rich, they have quick access to care, they have really high quality care, they are more likely to be discovered, they are in a circumstance that has high social capital, they're probably going to have a higher level of survivability than if somebody has the exact same type of suicide attempt, but it takes place within a context of somewhere that is more rural, perhaps, somewhere where it takes longer for them to get to care, somewhere where the people have less training about how to do rescue, or they have less capability to get to hospital or get to a clinic. So it could be the exact same suicide attempt in terms of what the individual characteristics are like, but because of the community context, it might influence whether that is going to turn into a suicide death or if it is going to be a rescued suicide attempt. So when you're looking at this very basic version of a suicide pathway, there end up being 5 intervention points in my perspective. One is when you have this kind of baseline level and you have prevention and wellness promotion, that's something that can keep a person more towards the status quo, right? It stops them from developing that higher risk, so it intervenes within that pathway. This might be things like increased nutrition, These are things that are more universal interventions. So it's increasing social and emotional capital within a group of people more generally. But then when somebody has developed higher risk already, there the interventions that we have are early interventions. And I say early intervention with regard to suicide, because it could be something that is already in the treatment realm for depression, or in the treatment realm for something like substance use, but is still going to be early intervention with regard to suicide because the person has not yet developed any type of suicidal behavior or suicidal thoughts. Once the person has become suicidal, then we are in the realm of clinical and crisis intervention. And there, the idea is to try to stop somebody who is already suicidal from having any suicidal behavior or suicide attempt. And if we are successful at that clinical and crisis intervention, we might be able to push them back to remaining at the suicide risk level without behavior, and perhaps continue having them move back in the direction of early intervention and then applying prevention or wellness promotion so that they move back closer to what would have been status quo. If we're not successful there and they move on to having a suicide attempt, at that point, our only option is emergency rescue. But if that is successful, then we can stop them from having lethal suicidal behavior. And instead, they might then just have a suicide attempt, which we can use as the intervention point to move them again back towards where they would have been with the status quo, or when they were at a point where we could use some depression treatment or something that's less than at the high crisis intervention level. I did say 5 though, because there is this very last part that often gets missed, and that is what happens after a suicide in terms of the people who have survived afterwards. Because the people who have then been exposed to the suicide death, whether you can label them as loss survivors or people bereaved by suicide, people who have suicide-related grief, those people, if they receive aftercare or post-intervention, which is basically intervention services to help them with their grief, help them with their loss, help them to get resources. We know that having exposure to a suicide, being connected or impacted by a suicide, places somebody in a higher risk category. So having those types of interventions for them will help to stop them from moving on their own risk trajectories. So that's our 5th intervention point. So then let's talk about what happens when we have that intervention. And we have somebody who had been on the status quo trajectory. They started shifting down towards suicide, but we were able to successfully bring them back up to that recovery level. I would say that the whole purpose of doing crisis intervention is to pivot, to take somebody from where they are on that downward trajectory to where they are pointed back up. And what happens after that pivot, I had thought about what might be a really simple, brief way to get people pointed in that upward direction, turning point direction. And so I created a brief mini course that is online called 6 Steps to Stable Ground. And I just wanted to kind of briefly overview what those 6 steps would be. One is pausing the action. It's a very simple thing that we can ask somebody to do, is to just not do anything. As long as they are not taking any behavior, we've immediately decreased their risk, even if they have suicidal thoughts. Those aren't really lethal. The only lethal thing is their actions. So if we could pause their action, we've increased their safety. The next thing is distraction or mindfulness. And I believe in the handout that is available, there is a worksheet that created to help people to figure out what might be really ideal distractions, so that if we are adding that into a safety plan or adding that into a hope box or some other way to get people to shift away from thinking about suicide, we can have them think about it in a very methodical way that will enable it to be easier for them to employ later on. We want to shift them away from thinking that it's impossible. And I know for myself, sometimes the idea is kind of this black and white thought that life is impossible, or the future is impossible, or getting things better is impossible. So putting that within the context of probability instead of kind of this black and white all or nothing type of perspective, to say, is it completely impossible for the future to get better? And if we can shift them away from saying it's 100% impossible, then that allows us to at least have some gradient there to say that it is possible to have a positive future, and that might give us a foot in the door. We have them explore kind of some reasons for living. And again, I have a worksheet that should be in the handout that I've used to try to think through what those reasons for living might be by looking at what people tend to think about that they wanted to achieve during their lifetime and might not have had a chance to do yet. So we say, let's just take the attention off of why you would want to die, and thinking about death, to thinking about what attached you to life. What were the things that you were looking forward to? And if we can get their mind to kind of shift in that direction, then again, we're finding a turning point. I have them make some kind of commitment to life, and making that commitment plain and in writing, shared with somebody else. And then finally, making a safety plan. And so let me talk a little bit about what a safety plan might entail. The safety planning intervention was developed by Barbara Stanley and Greg Brown. It's a brief and helpful type of therapy, and the idea is to have a plan that can then be taken home by somebody. So you see on the screen the patient safety plan template. This is the one that has been used often by the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and it includes warning signs at the top. Those are thoughts, images, situations that indicate a crisis might be developing. Some internal coping strategies that people can use to take their mind off their problems without contacting somebody else. And so then that goes back to what I was mentioning a moment ago for the distractions or for mindfulness. You have people in social settings that provide distraction in step 3. People you can ask for help in step 4. And these are the type of people who would be in that range of making a commitment to somebody. And then there's professionals or agencies for crisis and making the environment safe. So this was created to be used in the emergency department because it's brief, because it's something that a person could take home with their discharge plan, and because it is something that did not require a whole lot of clinical training in order to do the intervention. So now it's been used in many more places. I believe it's been used in Department of Defense, as well as VA care, and many other settings since then, including, of course, the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The research evidence shows that by using the safety plan, people might become less suicidal. They might have better follow-through afterwards to do their follow-up care. But what we see is that it depends on the quality of the plan, and it depends on how well the plan is used over time. The more frequently it's used, the more the person knows about it, the better off the effectiveness is. So you might have some initial plan that has been developed while somebody is in the hospital, but once they are out, one way to increase that quality and use over time is to revisit the plan and incorporate some of the elements that I was mentioning for those turning points, for those 6 steps to stable ground. And in that way, you are going back through the safety plan and incorporating aspects that are coming from that individual's perspective. And therefore, it incorporates their lived experience, including all of that prior context experience from their community, from their culture, from their language, the things that they themselves are identifying as being from their life beyond the clinical context that are relevant to both their downward trajectory as well as their upward trajectory towards recovery. So the idea for recovery is to shift them from where they are high risk to where they're at that baseline or pre-crisis level. The client kind of defines what their vision is, and you look at their current status, and that generates the support needs. One way to kind of differentiate between areas or spheres of life where a person might need support is looking at this dimensions of wellness that was developed by SAMHSA. And they had 8 dimensions of wellness. I'll just kind of run through them fairly quickly, but it's emotional health, which is kind of their perceptions of things, their physical health, which impacts their capacity, their spiritual health, which is their belief systems, their social health includes tangible and emotional supports that are available, their financial health, which includes basic needs, continuity of care, occupational is their employment, environmental is primarily their living space, and their intellectual health is their job or free time pursuits. The reason why I really enjoy using the dimensions of wellness concept is because it breaks apart the idea of quality of life into different realms. And thus somebody can see that there are some aspects of their life that are doing really well, even if there are some aspects where there are lots of challenges. And once you're able to identify where those specific aspects are that are challenges, you'll be able to specifically work on increasing those back up to their status quo while drawing on the strengths that are present in the dimensions of wellness where they are currently pretty strong. So that then is the quality of life and suicide, looking at it from a risk perspective. But part of the problem when you're looking at it from a risk perspective is that you're always looking downward. You're always checking to see if somebody is moving from status quo down towards that suicide trajectory. So we have to ask, is risk going to be the focus forever? You might imagine if you are running a race and you trip and you fall, and the first thing you do is you put your hands out, you try to brace yourself for impact, and then you check and see if you've been injured. You get back up, and imagine if once you've gotten back up, you hear the crowd yelling, and you think that they're encouraging you, but then you find out that the real thing that they're saying is to just not fall again. And they just keep chanting, "Don't fall again." Not particularly encouraging to somebody. You want them to encourage you to get back in the race, to run, to cheer that you got back up, because otherwise then the focus is just on the fall itself. You might imagine getting into a car and getting ready to get on a road trip, and you check your rearview mirror, and you check your brakes, and then imagine that you don't have a gas pedal. You don't have a way to move forward. All you have is the rear view mirror to keep looking at what happened in the past, and the brakes to stop you from doing something. But that's not going to be a really good way to get onto your road trip, because you need something that can have more forward momentum. What happens then when we're focusing just on risk? You have this constant attention to risk, and so it elevates the anxiety and the stress level. This chronic elevation in stress, frequent HPA activation, you might end up with more anxiety or depression, sleep problems, memory difficulty with concentration, and you might notice that some of these end up looking exactly like the risk factors for suicide. So we're not especially helping somebody if we are focusing just on risk. So instead I say, once you have that quality of life back up towards that recovery or status quo, area, you'll want to have them looking upwards instead of looking down. You might think, what is our focal point going to be? If you had it like a compass and suicide is here at the south, there's lots of possible ways to not be suicidal if you're going west, east, or other possible directions. But if you're pointed directly towards life, that's like heading north, in which case you can't go south at the same time. So I would say that the very best suicide prevention is when you are having very solid life promotion, and because then it is not going towards suicide at all. Let's talk a little bit about what those recovery-oriented outcomes might look like. You start off with a suicidal crisis, and here I have a picture of somebody who have lost perhaps their house or their community after a natural disaster. That's like our crisis point. If they go straight down, then they might be more like post-traumatic stress. But if they are able to rebuild, then that's more like recovery. We might say resilience is how fast and how effective they are at achieving recovery. Growth would be if they had nothing going on and they just decided to improve their house or improve their community. Post-traumatic growth is what happens when they have had this traumatic experience and then they are able to get back what they had before and then build something even better afterwards. And I would add a final character, which is post-suicidal growth. And there I have a picture of a pine cone, which I would usually go into more detail about. But the basic is that a lot of pine trees or conifers have a characteristic where they grow even better after a fire, and sometimes only grow after a fire. And so that's kind of a post-traumatic growth that is very specific to the fires. And so then it's more like a post-suicidal growth where it is drawing information from that suicide aspect. Post-traumatic growth is something that happens after the initial coping. This happens after the recovery. And the thing that contributes to this is finding meaning and finding benefits in the trauma that has happened. The person has some learning, and that learning helps them create change that boosts them past that trauma level. Some folks ask kind of about the relationship between post-traumatic growth and PTSD. Does this mean that somebody has not suffered if we're saying that they are moving towards post-traumatic growth? There was a study that was done with cancer patients, and what they found was that post-traumatic growth actually had a positive correlation with post-traumatic stress. This shows that the events did have high impact, but the post-traumatic growth moderated the connection between post-traumatic stress, quality of life, and depression. So what we see is that the help that post-traumatic growth adds is not necessarily decreasing the symptoms. It's saying that the symptoms of severe stress might not have to lead to decreased quality of life and depression once you are able to transform that experience. They have connected this to character strengths. Once somebody experienced post-traumatic growth, particularly they might experience increased kindness or bravery, changes in gratitude or hope, or religious connections as a result of how they process and how they transform the trauma that they've had. Some people ask if growth is possible after a suicidal crisis. Is that a type of trauma that can experience growth? And I sometimes reflect back to some that I read from Paul Quinet's book long ago, Suicide, the Forever Decision, where he said, an attempt on your own life, it doesn't have to automatically or an awful power, self-fulfilling prophecy lead to another attempt, but it can be an opportunity for a new start. It can be an opportunity for a rebirth. And he also said that the more we learn about dying, the more we can learn about living. And once we've learned more about both, we might be able to fully live all the life we have left to us. I feel pretty similarly to what Paul Quinet had suggested there. that it provides us an opportunity, a stopping point from which you can reflect and move forward afterwards. Now, when you're having this reflection, I sometimes say that you might have a very broad reflection like this here in the lake, and that's useful for a certain level of detail. If you're looking into something like glass reflection, you might be able to get to a higher level of detail. But you wouldn't want to like take a really close look there. There you want a mirror, something that will allow you to do really close inspection. So there's different kinds of reflection depending on the purpose that you have. Not that one is better necessarily than the other, but the purpose might be different. So when you're looking at reflection and growth, then I would say if you're having post-traumatic growth, you're looking at the overall experience. You are changing your philosophy about life in general. You're kind of getting a gestalt impression of the crisis and perhaps changing your life mission or values. There you're experiencing some of those character strengths, character growths. You have an evaluation of yourself, capabilities, strengths, life lessons. But with what I would describe as post-suicidal growth, you're looking specifically at the crisis experience. You're getting information about the person and their details of the crisis. You're looking at the critical beliefs and values that are expressed in those warning signs or expressed in what has led them, what were the critical events within their own life perspective. Their risk and protection, what their priorities are, and what their quality of life does look like. So then let's compare kind of the safety plan and what you might have as a growth plan. And again, I think I have a handout for this in the group of handouts. In the safety plan side, you're looking at warning signs. And on the growth plan side, you're taking those warning signs and translating them into what the person's needs or values or strengths might be. You're looking at coping strategies on the safety side, but then you're looking at ways to improve their coping on the growth side. So maybe they only have a few coping skills now, but there are some ways that they can add skills later. You might be looking at social situations and distractions on the safety side, and then ways to improve social connections on the growth side. On safety, you're looking at people who could help. And that might include people who are like crisis counselors, for example, or people who are specialists in the crisis setting. But on the growth side, you're looking at people who can help growth. And one reason why I like this is because it might include people into a person's plan that would not be appropriate for doing kind of crisis intervention, but might be really useful for increasing their personal growth or self-improvement. Then you're looking at professional help on the safety side, but professional resources for growth on the other side. On the safety side, you're looking at making a safe environment. So taking things away, perhaps, that might have high lethality. On the growth side, you're looking at a wellness environment. You're looking at things that would promote a person's life or attachment to life. Again, going back to that compass idea where you're trying to increase their strength connection to life, and thus you are directly countering their pull towards suicide. So just at the very end here, I wanted to point out one of the reasons, or another reason, why I think that moving towards more of a post-traumatic growth perspective is useful, going back to this quality of life and suicide graph. At the very start, you might have this, a certain level of distance between what their current quality of life is and how far it has to drop until it reaches that 0 point. Once they've developed a certain level of risk, it's even smaller. And so there's very little time or effort that you have in order to increase their trajectory back up. Once you get to recovery, you're kind of back at that same level of safety that you had at the start. But if you're able to get them into a growth situation, then there's even further that they have to drop before they are at that suicidal level. They have an even stronger base that keeps them away from suicide. And so again, pointing out that if you're able to help somebody to achieve growth, then you are directly impacting their suicide prevention as well. And with that, I'll close my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Lezine. Excellent. I really, there's so much here that is relevant to the kind of work that we do here. While people, please enter your questions into the Q&A box, let me ask one of my own quicks, which is, how do you, so here we are in a mental health context and largely acute care. You know, you've been here, and like any other, our necessary focus in some respects is on the risk side of the equation. We're driven there by so many contingencies. How is it, what would you recommend that we do as a health system to move more fully to the top side of that equation? How do we get away from the risk model in an appropriate way? We need to hold on to it.
Yeah, I think that you know, we definitely have to pay attention to risk. That's our baseline. That's the first part that we have for making that change, that transition, that turning point. But I've tried to in some of the writing that I have on my site, looking at when we're even examining their warning signs that somebody had, or their current risk factors. And at the very start, you're looking at how that might be interpreted within the context of their possible suicidality. But later you can examine them in terms of what information they might give towards somebody's priorities. So one of the ideas that I had for that is if somebody is withdrawing from things and you're noticing that as something that could be a risk indicator, once that risk has been kind of settled enough so that the crisis is averted, if you're flipping it over, you look at what somebody's priorities might be, because the things that they let go last are probably their highest priority. That's the thing that's closest to their heart. And so instead of just kind of ignoring what those warning signs were, once the crisis is averted, perhaps going back to some of those things, or if we're noting in a person's chart what the key aspects were that they were describing for perhaps loss of a relationship or loss of a job, going back to those in the viewpoint that these are things that they hold as high priorities. This is their high values. This is what they consider to be the most important qualities of life. So that if they have those, that's the type of loss, those are the types of drops in quality of life that lead them to feel like life is no longer worth living. We have more information about their priorities and about their values. So kind of extracting then from that risk side information about what's going on in the person, what they're most attached to, because those are the things that become most critical at those points.
Thank you. There's a question here about the premise. Is the premise that the trauma in some way primes the person for growth, consistent with crisis theory of some kind? And how does this differ from the notion of protective factors?
I'd say protective factors are things that would keep somebody from having further risk develop. And so there's probably a lot of crossover between protective factors and growth factors, especially in the context of growth factors later on becoming protective factors. I would say that it's definitely possible for somebody to experience growth without a crisis. And there's definitely times where somebody experiences a crisis without growth. But a crisis presents an opportunity. It's a breaking point between what a person was currently experiencing and what they might be experiencing afterwards. And I think that that breaking point, that clear stop that says that something was dramatically wrong within their life, presents an opportunity for them to reflect on what has been happening and what they might feel is important. And because we have that opportunity, that break within their thought process, that enables us to have possible positioning for growth afterwards, or at least for help to get back to that status quo quality of life. Hopefully to make it continue towards growth, but at least a break that allows us to move them back towards status quo.
Thank you. Comment here and a question. Thank you for your thought-provoking idea of a growth plan. I'm curious as to how you might introduce this idea to a patient who has recently been suicidal. That is, how do you get buy-in without invalidating their current pain?
I think that I probably would not try to introduce a growth plan right away. I think that initially you would want to focus on just a basic safety plan. And then in the process of revising the safety plan, you can move towards having growth aspects to it. I think that once somebody is not in crisis mode, they might have people or places who they want to incorporate into their life, but that don't really fit into the safety plan context. So for example, if you have a youth and they really like their coach, but the coach is not the type of person who would you would turn to in a crisis, but you want to keep that coach in the person's life because it is somebody who might have a protective factor, they can be put onto the growth plan side because it's somebody who can help them with their individual growth, even though it's not somebody who could be on the crisis side. And when they are exploring those possible distractions or coping skills on that safety plan side, you might feel like it's not quite adequate enough, or it's not quite ideal for what they personally would value, in which case you could put on the growth plan side some of the things that they might add into their coping skills toolbox in order to improve the safety plan. So really, I think that the growth plan is added on in a way that helps you to continue improving the safety plan and making it more strong and making it more individually customized to what the person's life is like.
Okay, thank you. A couple comments here of this sort. Thank you so much for a thoughtful and helpful presentation, for sharing the resources and handouts. Very generous of you. And then another asks, can you talk about your online program a bit and who it's designed for?
So I have a couple online. One is that 6 Steps to Stable Ground, which is designed kind of for somebody who has already passed that crisis point, but perhaps has not completely turned around yet towards life. So they're kind of teetering and wondering, how do you make that turning point? How do you make that complete pivot? And the other that I have online right now is one that looks at the safety planning a little bit more in depth, and how you translate that into more of a growth plan context, as well as some that explores more specifically the different warning signs that we've talked about within suicide prevention, and how you might look at those differently later within the context of informing a person's growth perspective.
And are they available for everybody on your website?
Yep, at livedexp.academy.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. I think we're essentially out of time here, and I want to thank you for all of us here in the Department of Psychiatry and beyond for being here today and presenting this really important perspective, which I think takes us out of our usual zone of practice, but in really important and helpful ways. So again, thank you very much. And with that, we will draw this session to a close. Look forward to seeing you in person.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.